Every single day, I drop a brand new video digging deep into the wild legends of Hollywood's golden age. If you're hooked on the untold stories of the stars who built the dream factory from the ground up, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, throw a like, or drop a comment. It helps more than you know and doesn't cost a dime. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's jump straight into this jaw-dropping story because Burt Lancaster couldn't stand Lee Marvin, and after years of rumors, we finally know the truth behind that tension. I was just 23 when I witnessed something that completely changed how I understood what it meant to be a man. Picture it, Christmas Eve, 1965, out in Death Valley, California, the desert heat finally giving way to a sharp chill, about 38 degrees Celsius, still brutal, but bearable. Most of the crew had already scattered, some writing letters home, others fighting over a barely working payphone just to hear a familiar voice. But two men didn't leave. Two Hollywood heavyweights stayed behind, and what went down between them that night ended their working relationship forever. Back then, I was just a camera assistant on a Western called The Professionals. My job was simple: load the film, stay quiet, stay out of sight. But that night, there was no staying invisible. Because what I saw had nothing to do with what the rumors later claimed. It wasn't about booze, even though plenty of bottles were lying around. It wasn't about professionalism, though that became the official excuse. And it sure wasn't about ego, even though both men carried enough of that to fill the Mojave Desert. No, this was about something much deeper, something dangerous, something that clawed at the one question every man of that era secretly feared: are you the real deal or just pretending? And here's the part that makes this story unforgettable. The man who asked that question, he wasn't wrong. By the end of that night, Burt Lancaster, the actor everyone praised as Hollywood's most disciplined perfectionist, had to face a truth he'd been running from for nearly 50 years. Meanwhile, Lee Marvin, the tough-as-nails war hero, proved that being authentic can turn into its own kind of cage. But before we hit that Christmas Eve explosion, you've got to understand who these two men really were beneath all the fame, the charm, and the studio polish. Forget the posters, forget the magazine smiles. We're talking about the real guys hiding under all that Hollywood armor. And trust me, neither of them were who you think. Act 1. The self-made warrior, Burt Lancaster. A man built from pure strength, every move rehearsed, every glance calculated. He was a walking performance of power. Burt Lancaster came into the world on November 2nd, 1913, in East Harlem, New York, a place where toughness wasn't an attitude. It was survival. The streets were rough, the money was thin, and every kid learned early that if you couldn't hold your ground, you'd fade fast. His dad held a steady job at the post office, but the pay barely stretched, and the Lancasters knew exactly what it meant to count every dollar. Young Burton. Stephen Lancaster learned one truth early: nothing gets handed to you. In that neighborhood, you either fought or vanished. Simple as that. But Burt had something sharper than fists. His body moved like art. He could leap, twist, and flip through the air like gravity was optional, like the sky itself bent to his will. Imagine watching a man build a cathedral brick by brick, except the cathedral was himself. Each muscle, a symbol of discipline. Each move carved with perfect control. By the time Hollywood came knocking, the kid from East Harlem had turned himself into a force. In 1965, at 52 years old, Burt Lancaster wasn't just a star. He was an empire, a producer, a businessman, a straight-up Hollywood power player. In a town where studios owned your name like a brand, Lancaster said, "No thanks," and built his own lane. Independence wasn't his motto, it was his mission. His daily grind? Legendary. He'd wake before dawn, 5 a.m. sharp. He'd run through desert heat that could break most men, then crush a workout so brutal it'd fold guys half his age. On set, he didn't touch a drop of alcohol, didn't smoke, didn't slack off. He followed the script of self-control like it was the Bible of success. The crew on The Professionals watched him with a mix of awe and tension. His focus had this cold, metallic edge. You didn't question it, you didn't test it. Burt treated his body like a weapon, something that had to be polished, oiled, and perfected every single day. He memorized every line until he could recite them backward without skipping a beat, and when it came to time, he was exact. Never early, never late. To him, precision wasn't just a habit, it was a creed, a law carved into his bones. In a town fueled by chaos, parties, and excess, Burt Lancaster stood like a statue of control, the Puritan at the Hollywood party, the monk in the casino. While everyone else lost themselves in fame, he built walls of discipline around his name. That restraint made him stand out, but it also made people uneasy. And here's the thing that most never caught. Behind that iron self-control, there was something else brewing. You could see it in his eyes, that quiet, measuring look he gave people. Not cruel, but cold. Like he was always testing, always weighing. Maybe he didn't even realize it himself. But that obsession with control? It wasn't just power, it was armor. Armor built to hide a weakness, something deep he couldn't admit even to himself. But what was he hiding from? What drove that need to dominate every part of his world? We're about to find out, because to understand what cracked Burt Lancaster's armor, you need to meet the man who smashed through it without even trying. Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin was everything Burt Lancaster wasn't, and that was exactly the problem. Born February 19, 1924, in New York City, 11 years younger than Burt, Marvin came from the same world, but he carried it differently, rougher, louder, and with no interest in control at all. When it came to life experience, Lee Marvin was playing a whole different game. In 1942, at just 18, he signed up for the Marines, not out of blind patriotism, and definitely not because he was out of options. No, as he once said, he enlisted to find out what he was made of. And trust me, he found out the hard way. On the island of Saipan, June 1944. The Battle of Saipan wasn't just a battle, it was a full-blown nightmare in the Pacific. The Japanese troops knew they were doomed, but they were determined to take as many Americans down with them as they could. In the middle of that chaos, young Lee Marvin got hit. A sniper's bullet ripped straight through his backside, slicing into his sciatic nerve. Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. That wound changed him forever. The pain, the trauma, it didn't just scar his body, it carved something raw and unshakable into his soul. You can't fake that kind of truth, not even in Hollywood. He spent 13 long months in naval hospitals, learning to walk again, living with pain that followed him like a shadow. The Marines gave him a Purple Heart, but that little piece of metal didn't even scratch the surface of what he'd been through. Yeah, Lee Marvin walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But those visible scars, they were nothing compared to the ones buried deep inside. If Burt Lancaster was a cathedral, built brick by brick, flawless and controlled, then Marvin was the wreck that survived the bombing. Bent beams, cracked walls, but still standing tall. You could see the fire in him, the kind that never burns out, it just changes shape. And that kind of fire, it rewires a man completely. Fast forward to 1965, Lee Marvin was on top of the world. Fresh off an Oscar win for Cat Ballou, he wasn't Hollywood's idea of perfect. He was Hollywood's new idea of real, rough edges, unpredictable energy, and zero polish. When Lee Marvin played a tough guy, no one saw an actor. They saw truth. Because for him, toughness wasn't a performance. It was memory. That bottle always in his hand, it wasn't just for laughs or good times. It was medicine, the only kind he trusted. When you've seen 19-year-old kids screaming for their mothers, when you've taken lives and still see their faces every time you close your eyes, whiskey stops being a drink. It becomes a shield, self-prescribed, self-dosed, and never really enough to quiet the noise, but it numbed the ache just enough to keep him moving. On set, Marvin was a wild card. He'd roll in late, forget a line here and there, sometimes show up smelling like last night's barroom. But when the cameras started rolling, everything shifted. The chaos inside him snapped into focus, and suddenly, the screen came alive. There was no acting, just raw presence. Pure electricity that couldn't be rehearsed or replicated. The crew couldn't help it. They started choosing sides. You had Team Lancaster and Team Marvin, Team Control versus Team Chaos, Team Precision versus Team Instinct. You could feel the tension like static in the air, two completely different versions of power staring each other down, but here's the twist. Nobody on that set, not even Burt or Lee themselves, realized what was really going on. This wasn't just about order versus destruction or discipline versus rebellion. It was something way deeper. It was about two men trapped inside their own definitions of strength, each chained to a different idea of what it meant to be a man. And that clash, it was about to explode in a way Hollywood would never forget. Soon enough, under that merciless Death Valley sun, 120 degrees of pure punishment, months of tension and heat were ready to ignite. All the fake smiles, all the on-set professionalism, it was about to melt away for good. Because when you throw two alpha legends into the same fire, one built from iron discipline, the other forged in raw trauma, the act ends and the truth finally starts to show. Act 2. The escalation. The first crack. The trouble kicked off in October. right at the start of principal photography. And let me tell you, Death Valley didn't earn its name by accident. That place was hell on earth, chosen on purpose because the story called for a scorching Mexican desert. The heat wasn't just background, it was a living, breathing beast. Every step on that red-hot sand felt like a dare, every take a battle against the sun itself. Burt Lancaster rolled in like a one-man army. No fancy private car, no entourage. He came on the truck loaded with film gear, surrounded by his own personal fortress of fitness. We're talking parallel bars, dumbbells, and a full-on portable gym that he set up in his hotel room like a drill sergeant at boot camp. While the other actors were cooling off at the local bar, Burt was in his room at 5 a.m., doing handstand push-ups against the wall, in Death Valley, at 52, just to make sure his muscles didn't lose a single ounce of definition during a 3-month shoot. Relentless doesn't even start to cover it. Then there was Lee Marvin. The man showed up with multiple suitcases, and the crew joked that one was for clothes and the rest were for bottles. And well, that wasn't exactly wrong. The first morning, director Richard Brooks called everyone in for a table read, and right away, the contrast was stark. Lancaster showed up 15 minutes early, script in hand, color-coded with 3 different pens like a master blueprint. Marvin? He strolled in 20 minutes late, script folded and crammed into his back pocket, eyes half open like he was fighting last night's hangover. Total opposites colliding in slow motion. It was like watching order and chaos shake hands just to see who'd flinch first. I remember it like it happened yesterday, Lancaster staring at Marvin with a look I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, it was curiosity, like a scientist studying an impossible equation that somehow still worked. The read-through went smoothly enough, but you could feel the clash in the air. Marvin, half awake but sharp in his own raw way, delivered his lines with this effortless realness. So natural, it made Lancaster's precision feel almost staged, like watching a Broadway rehearsal next to a real street fight. When they wrapped that read, I overheard Lancaster pull Richard Brooks aside and say, "Is he going to show up like this every day?" Brooks, who had wrangled some of Hollywood's most impossible geniuses, just smirked and said, "Lee's Lee. But wait till you see what happens when the camera rolls." Lancaster didn't look convinced, not one bit. You could see the doubt in his eyes, that perfectionist's tension building like steam in a sealed pipe. 3 weeks later, the production moved to Valley of Fire State Park in Nevada, a place that looked straight out of another planet. Jagged red cliffs, blinding rock formations, and a horizon that looked ready to swallow you whole. The heat didn't let up, it only got worse. The tension, even hotter, every day felt like a countdown to something about to blow. And between Burt's rigid order and Lee's reckless rhythm, everyone on set could feel it coming. The place looked unreal, like Mars had a baby with hell itself. Jagged red cliffs, endless fire-colored rock, and a heat so fierce it made the air shimmer. And right there, the ground rules were about to change again. That day's scene was no walk in the park. Lancaster and Marvin had to scale a cliff while fake bullets shredded the air around them, find cover, fire back, and hit every beat with perfect timing. It was a brutal, high-risk sequence that demanded razor focus, total coordination, and most importantly, sobriety. November 12th, 1965. Call time, 6 a.m. The desert was already cooking, 32 degrees at dawn and climbing fast. Lancaster showed up early, 5:45 sharp. Already in costume, already stretched out, already rehearsing. He ran through the climb and fight sequence with the stunt coordinator 3 times before Marvin even made it to set. Then, at exactly 6:47, Lee Marvin finally appeared. Sunglasses on, walking slow and careful, the kind of careful that says you're trying real hard to look steady. The plan was simple. Climb together, Lancaster leading, Marvin following. They'd rehearsed it just the day before. Should have been done in 2 hours, tops, but it dragged on for 9. 9 hours of sweat, dust, and tension thick enough to choke on. The problem? Marvin kept blanking on the choreography. Not the lines, those he nailed like a pro, but the physical routine? Forget it. Grab this rock, left foot here, pull up, wait for the blast, react, move. Simple directions turned into total chaos, over and over again. From my spot high on a ledge above them, I had the perfect view, especially of Lancaster. What I saw on his face wasn't anger, not yet. It was something heavier, frustration bubbling up, slow and steady, turning into something that ran deep. You could almost feel the storm building behind his calm eyes. Years later, I finally understood what was really burning in him that day. See, Lancaster had spent his whole life chasing one truth, that discipline could conquer anything, that self-control and relentless effort could crush weakness. Every dawn workout, every strict routine, every flawless take was proof that a man could build himself into greatness through sheer willpower. But then came Lee Marvin, half drunk, stumbling through takes, breaking every rule Lancaster lived by, and somehow he was still magnetic, still mesmerizing. The camera didn't care about Lancaster's perfection. It was hypnotized by Marvin's realness. It was like watching a master calligrapher who'd spent 30 years perfecting his brushstrokes suddenly see a kid with a crayon scribble something that felt alive. That raw, messy truth coming from Marvin made Lancaster's precision look almost cold. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just frustration anymore. This was a crack in everything he believed about being a man, about control, about worth. His entire philosophy, the idea that discipline equals greatness, was starting to crumble right there on that scorching cliff face. The injustice of it burned through him harder than the desert sun, because Marvin, with his hangovers and chaos, was stealing the spotlight effortlessly, doing wrong by every rule Lancaster worshipped, and still coming out golden on film. By the time we wrapped at 3:47 p.m., the sun had turned the valley into a blazing furnace. Lancaster didn't say a word to Marvin, not a glance, not a nod, nothing. He just walked right past him, his jaw locked tight, every muscle wound like coiled steel. The whole crew felt it. The air got thick with that unspoken tension. Something was breaking, and it wasn't just the heat. Everyone could tell the fuse was lit. By mid-December, 3 weeks out from Christmas, 3 weeks before it all exploded, the set was falling apart. What started as a film about professionals was turning into a real-life duel between two men who couldn't stand what they saw in each other's eyes. By mid-December, the whole production was running on fumes. The schedule was a mess, the terrain was eating everyone alive, and the heat, though starting to break, had already snapped everyone's patience clean in half. They were 10 days behind, and the studio was breathing down director Richard Brooks's neck. The crew was cooked, cranky, and ready to explode over the smallest things. And that's exactly when Lee Marvin made his biggest mistake. It was lunchtime, 45 precious minutes to grab a plate from the catering tent, find a scrap of shade, and pretend the desert wasn't slowly roasting us alive. Marvin, as usual, held court with the stunt guys, his crew, his people. They ate up his war stories and his reckless swagger, the way he talked about near-death experiences like they were bedtime tales. He'd earned their respect the hard way by doing his own stunts, breaking every safety rule, and laughing about it afterward. About 50 feet away, Burt Lancaster was doing what he always did, working out. Even in that desert heat, the man had his portable parallel bars set up, going through his routine like a machine built from discipline and pride. Every pull-up looked like a sermon about control. But Marvin? He was drinking again, not sloppy drunk, but that dangerous kind of functional drunk. The kind where the filter between thought and speech disappears. Loose enough to tell the truth, confident enough to keep digging the hole. He started talking about Hollywood actors, about who was real and who was just pretending. The stunt guys were all ears, loving every word. Then Marvin dropped the line that changed everything. He laughed and said, "You know what Burt Lancaster is? He's a circus performer who learned his lines. Talented, sure. Disciplined, absolutely. But real? Please. The man's been performing his whole life. He doesn't even know how not to perform." The stunt crew cracked up, thinking it was harmless, just Marvin being Marvin. But from where I stood, I saw the laughter freeze in the air like it had weight, because Burt heard every single word. He was mid-pull-up when it hit him. He stopped, just hanging there, silent, motionless, arms trembling with tension. Then, slow as ice melting, he lowered himself down. His face didn't move, but his eyes. Those eyes locked straight ahead like something inside him had just snapped. The laughter rolled on for a few seconds longer, until even the stunt guy started to sense the shift. The air went heavy, electric, like the sky right before a storm breaks loose. Lancaster didn't say a word, didn't look Marvin's way, didn't even glance. He just wiped his hands, walked straight back to his trailer, closed the door, and locked it. Silence. The kind of silence that hums with fury. Tight, sharp, alive. Later that night, the key grip found me near the trucks and muttered, almost under his breath, "This isn't gonna end well. Those two, they're gonna have it out. The only question is when." He was right. The when came fast. The countdown had started, and the clock was ticking toward Christmas Eve, just 10 days away. And when it finally happened, it wouldn't just be a fight, it would be an explosion that stripped both men down to their cores. Act 3. The confrontation, the setup. Christmas Eve, 1965. It landed on a Friday. The studio decided to give most of the crew a break for the holidays. 3 days off to cool down, see family, breathe something other than dust and stress. A bunch of them packed up and flew back to LA, grateful to escape the madness for a while. But not everyone left. Some stayed behind, and among them were the two men who couldn't escape each other, Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin. And in that empty, quiet stretch of Death Valley, where the heat had cooled but the tension hadn't, that's where everything was about to blow wide open. The main cast, the director, and a handful of key crew members stayed behind. Flying everyone home and back for just a long weekend was too expensive, so like it or not, we were spending Christmas in Death Valley. The production team did their best to make it festive, bless them. Someone strung up a few sagging lines of colored lights in the catering tent. There was a turkey laid out on the table, and a battered cassette player fought its way through Bing Crosby's White Christmas. On the surface, it almost looked cheerful, but underneath, it felt hollow. That kind of lonely, echoing cheer you only feel when you're stuck miles from home in the middle of nowhere, pretending the world outside the desert still exists. By 8 p.m., most of the crew had eaten, traded small gifts, and drifted off to their rooms, grateful for heat, silence, or just a moment of escape. The desert at night was eerie, not freezing, but sharp enough to remind you how far you were from civilization. The wild heat of the day faded into a strange, haunting calm. Still, a few souls lingered, clinging to whatever scraps of company they could find. The catering tent had turned into a makeshift bar. Someone had scored real whiskey. Not the cheap swill, but proper bourbon that burned smooth and warm, tasting almost like home. And of course, Lee Marvin was right in the center of it all, loud, laughing, drinking like the night was endless. His stories came rolling out, wild and reckless, his voice booming over the desert wind. And Burt Lancaster? Naturally, he wasn't there. No drinks, no small talk, no distractions. Just discipline. Always discipline. He was outside his trailer, alone under a flickering light. From where I sat, near the equipment truck loading film magazines for the next day's shoot, something I'd volunteered for just to have a little quiet and a smuggled beer, I could see him clearly. He moved slow and deliberate, like a man caught between purpose and punishment. It was 10:30 p.m., Christmas Eve, maybe 30 degrees out, and there he was, cranking out push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups on a metal bar he'd rigged between two support poles. The man turned the middle of the desert into a one-man boot camp. It was intense, and honestly, kind of heartbreaking. Watching him like that felt like watching someone bailing water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Every motion screamed of control, of defiance, of fear, that standing still meant losing everything he'd built. All that work against time, against age, against doubt. You could see it plain as day, the question written all over him. Does any of this still matter? And then, it happened. 11:17 p.m. I remember because I checked my watch, thinking about calling it a night. That's when Marvin's voice sliced through the still air, loud and mocking, tearing across the desert like a flare. "Look at him," Marvin shouted. "Look at him, the great Burt Lancaster doing push-ups on Christmas Eve. You know what that is? That's not discipline. That's fear." The words hit like a slap, sharp, echoing through the cold air, hanging there like a dare. A couple voices from the tent tried to smooth things over. "Lee, come on, man," someone called, trying to reel him back in. But Marvin wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The bourbon had cut loose the last of his restraint, and the floodgates were wide open. His voice grew louder, rougher, carried by that mean kind of honesty that only shows up when you've been drinking too long. "Fear of what?" someone asked. Maybe to calm him, maybe just curious. Marvin turned, pointing straight toward the dark outline of Lancaster's trailer, his tone dripping with challenge. "Fear of being ordinary," he yelled. "Fear that if he stops performing for one damn second, everyone will see what he really is." A pause hung in the night, long enough for the cold to bite through your jacket. Then someone from the tent, half laughing, half nervous, threw out, "And what's that, Lee?" Marvin didn't miss a beat. "A circus performer in a cowboy hat!" Laughter erupted, uneasy and sharp, bouncing off the rocks and tents. But behind it, everyone could feel that invisible line being crossed. The jokes weren't funny anymore. Something in the desert air had changed, thickened, tightened, like static before lightning strikes. And out in the darkness, under that single dim light, Burt Lancaster had gone completely still. A guy who learned how to flip and tumble and smile pretty, and somehow turned that into a career playing men. Marvin's voice cut through the tent, hard and sharp. The laughter died instantly. The silence hit like a slap. Then Marvin twisted the knife. "He'll never be a soldier, never be a warrior, never be a real man. I've seen real warriors, boys, 19, 20 years old, bleeding out in the sand on Saipan, crying for their mothers while they choke on their own blood. That's real pain, real sacrifice, real death." His voice cracked, bravado slipping into something raw and broken. The liquor couldn't hide it anymore. You could feel the truth bleeding through the performance. "And then Hollywood," he went on, voice shaking but fierce, "takes guys like Lancaster and me, and we put on costumes and pretend." The line hit like a hammer against steel. The laughter didn't just stop, it collapsed. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Marvin wasn't ranting anymore, he was confessing. "We play act trauma for money, but at least I know I'm pretending. At least I've got the decency to be ashamed of it." He took another drink, his hand trembling. "Lancaster, he thinks he's earned it through push-ups and willpower, like warfare's just another damn role you train for in a gym." The words hung there, cutting, ugly, too honest to ignore. They shattered whatever thin piece was left. And that's when the air changed. From the darkness just beyond the tent, a shadow shifted. Burt Lancaster stepped into the glow of the Christmas lights, slow, deliberate, silent. His face calm, his eyes unreadable. The kind of stillness that makes your stomach drop before anything even happens. I don't know how long he'd been standing there, but from the look on his face, serene, focused, deadly calm, you could tell he'd heard everything. He moved toward the tent, not rushing, not dragging his feet, just a steady, focused walk, like a man who'd already made up his mind. The voices inside fell quiet one by one, like candles snuffed out in a cold gust of wind. Lancaster crossed the threshold, and the whole tent froze. The only sound left was Bing Crosby crooning faintly from that old cassette player about white Christmases, a twisted soundtrack to a showdown about to go down. "Say it again," Lancaster said, his voice low, smooth, terrifyingly even. The calmness made it hit harder. You could hear the scrape of a chair, someone's sharp breath, then nothing. Marvin didn't flinch. Maybe it was the bourbon, maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was 20 years of ghosts finally stepping into the light, his eyes locked on Lancaster's. "You heard me," he said. "I did," Lancaster replied, stepping closer, his voice steady as ice. "But I want to make sure everyone else hears it too. You think I'm a fraud? A circus performer playing dress-up? Is that about right?" You could feel the tension snap across the tent like a wire under pressure. The words weren't loud, but they hit with force. Every syllable was clean, sharp, deliberate. Marvin stood up, unsteady, but not weak. The whiskey glow was gone. His eyes were clear now, clearer than they'd been in weeks. "You want the truth?" he said. "Yeah, that's what I think." The air between them tightened. Two men, two versions of masculinity, standing toe-to-toe under a string of cheap Christmas lights like they were in a prize ring. Marvin took a step forward. "You've spent your whole life trying to control everything, your body, your career, your image, but you can't control the one thing that actually matters." Lancaster didn't blink. "And what's that?" Marvin's voice broke, but he didn't back down. "You weren't there when it mattered," he said. "When the real test came, World War II, you were stateside, entertaining troops, putting on shows while guys like me were dying in the Pacific." A few gasps broke the silence, but Marvin kept going, relentless, shaking, too deep in it to stop. "And now you play tough guys. You play soldiers and warriors and rough men, and you do it so damn perfectly with so much discipline that people believe it." He jabbed a finger toward Lancaster's chest, his voice dropping into a ragged whisper. "But I know. The words echoed sharp and final, bouncing off the tent walls and into the desert night. And right there, under those flickering Christmas lights, surrounded by the stunned faces of a half-drunk film crew, Hollywood's two toughest men stood inches apart, stripped bare by truth. The words hit like a hammer. No theatrics, no shouting, just cold judgment slicing straight through the tent like a blade. "Because I was there, and you weren't." That line cracked the air open like thunder. The silence that followed didn't just hang, it vibrated, sharp and electric. What happened next only comes to me in flashes, like pieces of film burned by too much light. I remember Lancaster's jaw tightening. That famous granite jaw that had clenched 1,000 times on screen to show controlled rage, but this time, it wasn't acting, it was real. His hands trembled just barely, not from fear, but from the brutal, disciplined effort of holding himself back from doing what every instinct in his body screamed to do. The whole tent felt it, every ounce of that restraint, that storm trapped inside steel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, measured, that quiet kind of anger that's worse than shouting. "You're right," Lancaster said, "about some of it." The tent froze. Marvin blinked, thrown for a second. He'd been braced for rage, denial, maybe even a swing. But not this, not calm. "I wasn't at Saipan," Lancaster went on. "I didn't storm beaches. I didn't get shot. I didn't watch my friends die." He paused. "I was in Italy, special services, entertaining troops, putting on shows." The words landed heavy, but they didn't sound weak. They sounded honest. Marvin blinked again, the fire in his eyes flickering, off balance, unsure of where this was heading. Then Lancaster took a step closer, his tone sharpened, like a blade hidden under silk. "But let me tell you what I was doing while you were getting drunk on survivor's guilt and calling it authenticity." The shift was like a wave crashing, soft voice turning sharp, that famous steel creeping back in. "I was building, every damn day, building a body that wouldn't quit, building a craft that couldn't be ignored, building a career from absolutely nothing." He took another step. His voice rose, controlled, precise, every syllable hitting like a hammer. "You know where I came from? East Harlem. My father worked for the Postal Service. We had nothing. And I clawed my way up, from circus tents to busted vaudeville acts, performing for empty rooms where the only applause came from my own stubbornness." Each word slammed into the air like a strike. The tent was so silent, you could hear the desert wind drag against the canvas. "And you know what I learned from all that?" he continued, eyes locked on Marvin. "Discipline beats talent. Control beats chaos. Building yourself beats waiting for the world to hand you something." He paused, just for a breath, but the quiet that followed felt deafening. "So, yeah," he said finally, "you went to war. You got shot. You earned a medal. Good for you." The way he said it wasn't mocking, but it wasn't kind either. It was stripped bare, fact over feeling. "But what did you do with it, Lee?" Lancaster's voice dropped, colder now. "You turned it into an excuse to drink, to show up late, to treat every job like it's beneath you. You think seeing real death gives you a free pass? Because you've seen things, right?" He leaned in, his voice cutting sharp and low. "Well, let me tell you something about real things." The air was thick enough to choke on. Two men, two philosophies of strength colliding in front of everyone. Discipline versus damage, pride versus pain. Decades of buried truth hanging between them like a live fuse, ready to blow. "This," Lancaster said, his voice slicing through the stillness, "is real." He hit his chest with an open hand. "This work, this craft, this discipline, it's as real as anything that ever happened on that beach." Then his eyes narrowed, the words landing with surgical precision. "The difference between us, Lee," he said, "is that I built my strength. You got yours handed to you by a bullet, and you've been coasting on it ever since." The punch in that line didn't need volume. It carried the force of truth, sharp and merciless. Marvin's face drained, his jaw twitching, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Lancaster stepped even closer, towering over him. Marvin had to tilt his head back just to meet his eyes. You could almost hear his heartbeat against the tent walls. "You'll never work with me again," Lancaster said. His tone didn't rise. It dropped, flat, final, lethal. "After this film wraps, our professional relationship is over. Not because of tonight, but because I can't respect a man who mistakes trauma for achievement." Nobody moved. Not one word was spoken. Even Bing Crosby had stopped mid-song, the cassette clicking into silence. Then Lancaster turned, smooth, precise, controlled, and walked out. every movement measured, every step exact. The tent's thin flap rustled behind him as he disappeared into the cold desert night, leaving nothing but the echo of his words and the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was the end of something. Two men, two worlds, split by truth that cut too deep to heal. Lancaster walked back toward his trailer, the desert light dim and ghostly around him. For a moment, the tent stayed absolutely still, dead, quiet. The kind of silence so deep it makes you aware of your own heartbeat thumping in your chest. Then, somewhere near the table, someone reached over and clicked off the cassette player. The sudden stop of Bing Crosby's voice made the quiet feel even heavier. Another voice broke the stillness, dry, tired, and cracked from the long night. "Merry Christmas," he muttered. It was the least merry sound I've ever heard in my life. But here's what none of us understood that night. Not the crew, not Marvin, not even Lancaster himself. Both men had told the truth, and both men had lied. Act 4. The Revelation. What Nobody Knew. The film wrapped on January 14, 1966. Lancaster and Marvin finished the shoot with cold professionalism. No shouting, no scenes, no more words beyond what the script demanded. They worked side by side, but never in the same frame again. Director Richard Brooks had quietly rewritten the final sequence just to keep them apart. Funny thing though, sometimes that kind of distance shows up on film in the best way possible. When The Professionals finally hit theaters, critics couldn't stop talking about the chemistry between the two stars. They called it raw, powerful, authentic. The tension felt real because, well, it was. The truth had burned straight through the fiction, and audiences could feel it. The movie exploded into a hit, a defining film of its decade. But behind the scenes, Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin never spoke again. Not one word. Not at premieres, not at studio events, not even when both were nominated for awards. It was like that night in the desert had sealed something between them forever, a silence too deep to cross. As for me, I left Hollywood in 1968. I got married, had kids, built a life far away from the bright lights, the egos, and the constant noise of that world. That night in Death Valley faded into a story, one I'd tell now and then at parties when the drinks were flowing and nostalgia got the best of me. I once saw Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin nearly come to blows on Christmas Eve, I'd say, and people would laugh, shake their heads, and call it a classic Hollywood story. And for 58 years, that's all it was to me, a story, until 2023. It was a dusty afternoon, and I was cleaning out my garage, digging through old boxes filled with relics from a life half forgotten. Call sheets, production notes, faded black and white photos, the leftovers of a kid who once brushed against fame and thought it would last forever. And buried at the bottom of one box, under decades of paper and dust, I found something that stopped me cold, something that changed the way I saw that night and those two men forever. It was a file, an official-looking military file, yellowed with age, stamped and sealed. Burt Lancaster, U.S. Army Records. I don't even know how it ended up in my stuff, probably grabbed it by accident from the production office when I packed up after the shoot. But inside was his complete World War II service record, and what I read there flipped the entire story on its head. Burt Lancaster hadn't avoided combat. He hadn't chosen the easy path. He had tried, again and again, to enlist in frontline units. 1942, 1943, twice in 1944. Each time he'd been rejected. The reason? Flat feet. A circus injury from his acrobat days. Minor enough for him to still leap, tumble, and perform with the grace of a machine, but serious enough for the U.S. Army to stamp him 4F, not fit for combat. Period. Imagine that, the strongest man in Hollywood, the icon of self-control and iron will, barred from fighting because of flat feet. And sitting there in my garage, 6 decades later, it hit me like a freight train. I finally understood everything. Every dawn run through the desert, every push-up, every drop of sweat, every perfectly carved muscle. It wasn't vanity, it wasn't pride, it wasn't even about discipline anymore. It was penance. Penance for something he could never change, for being kept out of the one test that defined manhood in his generation, for watching from a distance while others went to war, for living with that gnawing question that no amount of trophies or applause could silence. If I'd been allowed to go, would I have measured up? That was the wound he carried, the one no camera could see, the one he tried to outrun with every rep, every film, every perfect performance. And Lee Marvin? What about his side of the story? His drinking, his anger, that edge that never left his eyes. Turns out, that wasn't just PTSD. It wasn't just survivor's guilt. That weight he carried was heavier than even he knew. Because for all the blood he saw, for all the medals and scars, Marvin's real war had never ended. The battlefield just changed locations. It moved inside him. And when he faced Lancaster that night under the desert stars, it wasn't just one man calling out another. It was two soldiers of a different kind, each haunted by the war they did or didn't fight, each one trying to prove in their own way that they were still real. And suddenly, after all those years, I understood what Christmas Eve, 1965, had really been about. It wasn't a fight between two actors. It was a reckoning between two broken men, each staring at the version of himself he could never accept. It was the cruelest truth of all. The worst thing that ever happened to Lee Marvin, the wound that nearly destroyed him, also became the best thing that ever could have happened to his image. That bullet, that pain, that trauma, it gave him something no charm, no training, no talent could ever buy: authenticity. It proved he was real, that his toughness wasn't an act, that his pain wasn't a costume. The world believed in him because his scars were visible, but that came with its own kind of nightmare. Because what happens to your identity when the only thing that makes people believe in you is the very thing that almost killed you? If he hadn't gone to war, if he hadn't been shot, would anyone have looked at him the same way? Would they still call him a real man? Or would he have been just another actor playing dress-up, trying to sell grit with a camera close-up and a hard stare? Two men, both trapped. Lancaster, locked out of the war that would have proved his strength. Marvin, chained to a war that defined his, each one haunted by what the other represented. Burt Lancaster, the man who built himself out of nothing but willpower, was forever barred from the one test he believed would prove he was enough. Lee Marvin, the man who survived that test, was chained to it for life, his identity forever tied to blood, to pain, to a memory he couldn't escape. And that's the cruel symmetry of it all. They didn't just hate each other, they hated what they saw in each other. Lancaster saw in Marvin the validation he could never earn. Marvin saw in Lancaster the peace he'd never have. And underneath all that anger, both men hated themselves for needing that validation in the first place. But here's where it hits hardest. If you've made it this far, if you're still watching or listening, you're probably not a kid anymore. You're probably over 50, maybe 60. You've lived, you've built, you've lost, you've endured, you've fought through your own kind of heat and silence. And maybe, just maybe, you've felt that same question burning deep inside somewhere. Maybe you're like Lancaster. Maybe you built yourself from scratch, through sweat, through focus, through sheer refusal to be ordinary. You crafted your life like a fortress of control and discipline. But deep down, there's still that quiet whisper asking, does it count? Does self-made strength carry the same weight as being battle-tested by pain? Does surviving discipline measure up to surviving life itself? Or maybe you're more like Marvin. Maybe you've been through it. The heartbreaks, the losses, the scars life doesn't let you forget. You carry them like proof, badges of endurance, tokens of survival. But every now and then, in the middle of a quiet night, maybe you catch yourself asking, is that all I am? Am I nothing but my scars? It took me 60 years to understand the truth buried inside that night in Death Valley, the one that neither of those men could face. The question itself is the trap. The second you start asking, am I real enough? Am I tough enough? Have I earned the right to be who I am? You've already lost the fight, because authenticity isn't a trophy you win. It's not a badge someone else gives you. It's not even something you can prove. Authenticity is what happens when you stop chasing it, when you stop comparing your story to someone else's pain. It's what's left when you drop the performance, the pride, and the punishment. Burt Lancaster spent his whole life trying to prove he was real, through perfection, through control, through a body so disciplined it became a weapon. He was like a man who'd learned to forge his own signature perfectly, every line flawless, every stroke precise, but still empty of meaning. And Lee Marvin? He spent his life trying to prove his pain meant something. He wore his trauma like a medal, clutching it tight, like a man holding onto a terrible trophy he never wanted in the first place. Two men, one punished by control, the other punished by survival, both trapped in different cages built by the same question: what makes a man real? And the answer, all these years later, turns out to be the simplest one of all: you already are. And in the end, neither of them could stop flashing their receipts to the world. Proof of their pain, proof of their power, proof that they mattered. Both men were performing. Both men were prisoners of their own legends. The tragedy wasn't that they hated each other. Hate's easy. It's clean, simple, quick. The real tragedy was that they were right to hate each other, because each man saw in the other the thing he feared most about himself. Burt Lancaster looked at Lee Marvin and saw something he could never fake: raw, wounded authenticity. That realness that no amount of control or perfection could buy. And Marvin? He looked at Lancaster and saw success that wasn't built on pain, discipline without destruction, achievement without scars. And that forced him to face the darkest thought of all. What if my suffering wasn't the price of greatness? What if it was just suffering? That's the heartbreak right there. The one truth both of them missed completely. Closing, the resolution. You don't have to choose between discipline and authenticity. You don't have to be one or the other. Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin, Hollywood titans, the tough guys from the professionals, spent their entire lives trying to prove which mattered more. Lancaster believed in control. Marvin believed in chaos. Each man spent his life defending his version of what made him real. And in the end, both were wrong. Because the truth is, being real isn't about performance, pain, or perfection. It's about acceptance. It's about dropping the act, letting go of the measurement, and finally seeing that you were always enough. Before you close this video, I want you to try something for yourself. Think about that one person you've been hardest on, the one whose confidence, success, or strength always rubbed you the wrong way, the one who makes you feel like you're missing something. Now, ask yourself this: what do they have that scares me? What do they make me afraid I'll never have? Because that feeling, it's not really about them. It's about you. It's about the story you've been quietly telling yourself for years about what makes you real. Lancaster and Marvin never figured that out. They carried that resentment to their graves, still performing for ghosts that stopped watching decades ago. But you don't have to. You can stop performing, you can stop proving, you can stop measuring your worth by someone else's pain or someone else's perfection. When you finally drop that weight, when you stop chasing the idea of being real enough, you'll see it clear as day. You already are, you always were. If this story hit something deep in you, if it made you think about your own scars, your own strength, or your own definition of what it means to be real, share it. Send it to someone who might need to hear it tonight. And hey, before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about this story, or what other forgotten Hollywood tales you want me to dig into next. Your support keeps these hidden stories alive, and trust me, we've got plenty more scandals, secrets, and untold truths coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.